Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this extremely exciting project. My name is Jamie Adler, and I am one of many people who helped put this together. I teach language arts at Timberlane. Last spring, at a graduate program that Dave Sherwin and I were attending, he had an idea. Rather than continue the traditional format of summer reading, wouldn't it be exciting to do something new? Using his experience with one school, one book, and some research he had done about that program in other places across the country, he proposed the idea of Hopewell adopting it, but not just adopting it, bridging the two schools, middle and high school, the ages that so desperately needed to find out what they believed. After reading essays this summer, the students, 8th and 9th graders filled out reflective journals and brought them into school with them in September. They spent the first 2 weeks learning about the program and the rationale behind it. All 8th and 9th grade English students spent their time talking about values, beliefs, memories, and feelings, and it resulted in each and every single 8th and 9th grader in Hopewell Valley writing a personal belief statement. It's hard to believe that this started last year, but a group of us, Andy Paul, Johanna Claps, Dave, myself, all the teachers of freshman English, and all the teachers of 8th grade language arts, along with our supervisor, Sarah Greya, worked together to write a grant that the HVEF so graciously funded for us. Because of their generosity, along with the Timberlane PTO and the Central High School, we were able to bring Dan Gediman, executive producer of This I Believe from NPR, to Hopewell Valley to work with you tonight and to work with 700 students tomorrow. We are so proud to say that this has been a successful endeavor, a successful revamp of a summer reading program, and has brought our notoriously close-knit community even closer together. I'm going to introduce Dan Gediman, the executive producer of This I Believe, a not-for-profit organization that engages people in writing and sharing essays describing the core values that guide their daily lives. These short statements of belief have been featured on public radio since 2005. Gediman is the co-editor of the New York Times bestseller list of This I Believe 2, This I Believe on Love, This I Believe on Fatherhood, and This I Believe on Motherhood. I have to read that one. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to introduce Mr. Dan Gediman.
Thank you so very much to Jamie for introducing me, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful Wednesday night. It is Wednesday, isn't it? I think so. My name is Dan Gediman, and I do run This I Believe, the nonprofit organization that brings the This I Believe series to the radio airwaves each week. We also do a weekly podcast. I just recently became aware that our weekly radio show is not heard in this part of New Jersey, so if you are intrigued by what you hear tonight and want to hear a lot more of it, you can go to our website, thisibelieve.org, and sign up for our weekly podcast, and each week you'll get a fresh new essay in your telephone or MP3 player or computer queue to listen to. I'm really excited to be here this night, and I was sharing with some of the fine folks from the middle school and high school here and the local school system that New Jersey has been a very fertile area for This I Believe. This is my 4th trip to New Jersey. I have been to, and I hope I'm going to get all these names right, William Patterson University in northern New Jersey, and boy, I'm already forgetting the name of the college in southern New Jersey Stockton College, yes. And I have been to the Lenape School District's high schools, which is apparently about 45 minutes away from here. And now I'm here in Hopewell Valley. So I'm very excited to be here. And I'm hoping that I can come back. I've really enjoyed my time in New Jersey so far. So my job tonight is, before we get started, it would be helpful for me, to the best of my ability, to see past the lights. How many of you that are here tonight knew about This I Believe before this particular community initiative was announced? Okay, very good. Hands down. Okay. How many of you had heard it on public radio? All right. How many of you are familiar with our books that we've published? All right, very good. Okay, I guess go ahead and turn the lights down. Okay. The reason I do that is because it helps me to get a feel for how many people don't know anything about this. Oh, I should have asked that question. You don't have to turn the lights on. I think I can figure this out. How many of you really don't know a whole lot about this, I believe, and we're just kind of intrigued enough to come out tonight? Okay, good deal. So we're going to start with some remedial, This I Believe 101 stuff for you all. And for those of you who know all this stuff, we'll get to the, some other stuff a little later. But for the benefit of those of you who are not real familiar, and maybe for the benefit of those of you who came to this through our public radio series or our books and maybe don't know some of the backstory of This I Believe, it's a really good story that has local roots. And depending upon the amount of time I have, I usually go even farther back in history to tell this story. But I'm going to try to telescope this to leave plenty of room for what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about this, I believe, for about the first hour of this presentation. Then we're going to bring up some members of the community who are going to read their own This I Believe essays. And then there's going to be some time at the end for you to ask questions, which is what these microphones are down here at the end of the two aisles. And so that's what we're going to do. And also I'm going to play you some excerpts from some This I Believe essays that are in particular featured in the book that is being used by the students here and those of you who have been following along with the book that you've been using in this community, This I Believe Life Lessons. So the sort of granddaddy of This I Believe was a book that was published back in the 1920s. And it was called Personal Philosophies. Personal Philosophies. And it was the brainchild of a guy named Clifton Fadiman. How many of you are old enough to remember the name Clifton Fadiman? Okay, all right. Now, I actually remember Clifton Fadiman. When I was a kid, he was on game shows. He was sort of an eminence grise who would be on, like, To Tell the Truth or What's My Line or something. And he was a very interesting man. He'd been a book editor and a writer and a critic and a kind of a public intellectual and was very influential in American life and letters especially, and to some degree academia and broadcasting. But back in the 1920s, he was working in publishing, and he is largely responsible for the development of the paperback as a popular way of disseminating literature. And it was very much intended to be a populist thing to meet the needs of largely an immigrant population that was starting to become more and more of the majority of the country. Folks who had not, English was a second language. They were just starting, maybe they'd never been to school in this country before. They were going into night school. That was sort of you started to get a lot of night school, especially in major metropolitan areas. There were settlement houses that people were going to classes, and this whole notion of bettering yourself and, kind of upward mobility, especially for working class immigrant people, was very much in the air in the 1920s. So he published a series of books specifically for that audience. And one of the books he published was called Personal Philosophies. And it was a series of essays written by major public figures of the day, writing about their personal philosophies of life. Okay? And this book became a phenomenon. It sold millions of copies in paperback form, little like, 5 cents or maybe a dime, I think they were. And it was widely read all over the country and became a real phenomenon. In 1939, as the world was lurching toward World War II, he came up with the idea of revisiting that book. And he went back to the people who had written those essays back in the 1920s, which were some really major figures like H.L. Mencken, Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw. They were really major figures in the world of letters all over the world. And those who were still alive, he asked them to write new essays and basically muse on what has changed about their personal philosophies between the 1920s and this tumultuous time in the late 30s when the world was, standing on the verge of World War. And that book was also a best-selling book and a publishing phenomenon. So flash forward to the late 1940s, the post-war era. And it was a period, and some small group of folks here lived through that time, and the majority of you did not. I did not. But it was, for a lot of people, it was a very challenging time. Challenging in the sense that this nation was really going through major changes. Economic changes, socioeconomic changes. In almost every area, the country was changing dramatically. A lot of it had to do with the fact that for almost, 20 years prior to that point, America had been in a period of great deprivation, or at least 15 years. You had the 1930s, you had the Great Depression, then you had the 5 years of World War II, rationing. People didn't have a lot of stuff. They didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have a lot of stuff. So all of a sudden, World War II ends, and for the first time, people have some money. Their business is booming. First, you had all of the, the armament factories and all of the war-related industries that were hiring people. And then after that, a lot of those turned into, auto factories and tire factories and all of the sort of heavy industry that fueled the rise of the middle class in this country. Then you had all of the returning GIs coming back from the war who were on the GI Bill, which was a newfangled invention. And they're all going to college. In many cases, for the first time, the first people in their families to go to college or university. And all of a sudden you have people with well-paying jobs, buying houses in the suburbs, buying cars, sometimes 2 cars. In many cases, this is the first time people in the history of those families had moved out from urban areas where they had lived maybe for decades, generations. So it was a time of great sort of cultural unrest in the sense that people were not living where their families lived. They were not going to the churches they'd been raised within, or other religious denominations, or congregations, I should say. People were just being sort of wrenched out of what they were used to, and all of a sudden they had money. So these two things conspired to sort of rent the fabric of a lot of what held America together. There was a drop, some of you may remember from about maybe 15 years ago, Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And it was all about this phenomenon, although he was writing about it later in time, of people getting progressively farther away from such things as social clubs, fraternal organizations, the Elks, the Kiwanis, all that sort of thing, that had been very important in this country, especially earlier in the 20th century. Again, people not being a part of the church communities, and the religious communities that they'd been raised in, which was very important, especially in Catholic communities. You might have been born, raised, and died in the same parish. Now all of a sudden you're living out in the suburbs, and it's a completely different group. So church attendance was down, club attendance was down, fraternal orders were waning. People were just less involved with society, more involved with materialistic goals, getting ahead, getting a better job, getting another car, getting a house, all that sort of stuff. This is the backdrop against which this, I believe, was created. And this, I believe, was intended to be an antidote to all of that. Okay? So there was an overt kind of didactic hope on the part of the people who created this, I believe, to provide an alternative to that kind of materialistic thinking and motivation. Okay, so that's part of the story. Another part of the story is that this was a period of great upheaval in this country in terms of politics. So those of you who have studied this period of time a little bit, and for those of you who lived through this period of time, I don't need to remind you, this was the rise of the Red Scare. So, immediately after World War II, and really in the tail end of World War II, we were terrified of the Soviet Union. And almost everything we did near the end of World War II was all about keeping the Soviets at bay. and not letting them have as much. I just learned something this week that I never knew before. One of the main motivations of Harry Truman in dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was to scare the Soviets from expanding their influence in the Pacific. He wanted to end the war so that America could be sort of in charge of what was going to happen in the South Pacific and not the Soviet Union. So it's amazing how much our fear of the Soviet Union affected everything that went on for the next really 30 or more years in this country. So it was a period of time where you could get in big trouble for speaking your mind about your core beliefs, especially if those core beliefs did not sort of ascribe to the party line of anti-communism, sort of pro-America, patriotism, that kind of thing. And anything that might be remotely critical of the government or the status quo or capitalism or anything like that was grounds for losing your job. If you were a teacher, you had to sign loyalty oaths. In many corporations, you had to sign loyalty oaths, or you couldn't get or keep your job, saying that you've never supported any subversive organizations, you've never given money to a labor union, you've never belonged to a labor union, nobody in your family ever belonged to a labor, and really it was bad news. So there was an enormous chilling effect in this country in the late 1940s of people speaking their mind. And there was a third thing going on during that period that very much informs the birth of this, I believe. And you're going to hear all of this come together in a moment. I'm going to play you an excerpt of the very first episode of the very first incarnation of this, I believe, which happened in the early 1950s. The third piece of the puzzle is the bomb, which I alluded to a moment ago. For those of you who lived during this period, you don't need reminding about this, but for those of you who did not, it's sort of hard to imagine how terrified America was of the existence of weapons of mass destruction and the fact that people who didn't like us possessed them. As a child, I grew up in the 1960s. I have a vivid memory when planes would fly anywhere remotely low over my house. I was convinced these were, bombers, and they were going to drop the big one. Slightly older people than I had the experience of duck and cover drills in school, where just like a fire drill, you'd have to get underneath your desk and cover your head as though that was going to do anything, in case the bomb dropped on your school. Everybody had fallout shelters in their backyard, and you knew where to go in your community. They had those little logos for civil defense and all that. So these are the three building blocks that sort of inspired the people who created this, I believe, to create this, I believe. Fear of impending destruction, political fear and the fear of expressing yourself in public, and this sort of materialistic, anti-spiritual, anti-philosophical kind of bent that the country was in. So that's the big backstory. So there were three men, two of whom were native Philadelphians, who came up with the idea for this, I believe. The main guiding force was a guy whose name was Ward Wheelock, and he was a very successful advertising executive, multi-generational native Philadelphian, and he had the Campbell Soup account. And as I think all of you know, Campbell Soup was and is a pretty large entity in this area. And Campbell Soup was the sponsor of Edward R. Murrow and his nightly newscast, and eventually his forays into television. So back then, if you were a media figure, your livelihood was wholly dependent on a corporate sponsor, okay? Because there was no such thing as a TV show or a radio show that had 15 different commercials within it. It was one sponsor. So it was the Chase and Sanborn Hour. It was the Lucky Strike Hour. It was, the Maxwell House Hour. And that sponsor controlled your livelihood. So Edward R. Murrow's star was largely hitched to Campbell Soup, and this man, Ward Wheelock, who controlled that account and led it to CBS to sponsor Edward R. Murrow. He was inspired to go to Edward R. Murrow and to the president of CBS, who was another native Philadelphian, William S. Paley, and pitched this idea to them. And it was a very simple and elegant and powerful idea. For 5 minutes a day, a prominent American would step forward in front of a microphone and share their core beliefs with American listeners. And there was this, as I mentioned before, this overt sort of didactic, preachy subtext to this, which is that the average American would listen to these and be inspired to live a more uplifted life, a more thoughtful life, a more mindful life, and not be so devoted to chasing a buck or material possessions. And then Murrow brought to the equation sort of this larger concern about the political health of America and its civil liberties being eroded by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and later and famously McCarthy, who he, you know, obviously there's a, I don't know how many of you saw the film Good Night and Good Luck, but, you know, there's very dramatically told the story of the Murrow-McCarthy kind of on-air battle. But McCarthy was not yet a major figure at this point in time. So the pitch of this guy, Ward Wheelock, was, let's fix what's wrong with America by putting these little essays about personal belief inspired by those books I told you about that were best-selling books in the 20s, 30s, 40s, these personal philosophies. So they went on the air in 1951 in June, I believe, as a local Philadelphia program. And the idea was just like a Broadway show, you know, they try it out in Boston or Hartford or Philadelphia before going to Broadway. They were going to try out this, I believe, in Philadelphia to see if it had legs. And it aired on WCAU, the local CBS affiliate. And the very first episode was essentially a soliloquy from Edward R. Murrow explaining in shorthand, in very poetic shorthand, everything I just told you. In terms of, it's sort of a mission statement for this, I believe, and what the point of this series was. And I'm going to let you hear it. And if you're not familiar with the sound of Edward R. Murrow's voice, it is an incredibly resonant, beautiful voice, and his writing is second to none in the history of broadcast journalism. And by this point in time, in 1951, he was a household name. I mean, he had long since made his name as a war correspondent, going back to the 30s and all through the war. He was as familiar a voice to Americans and really people all over the world as anyone I can think of, with the possible exception of FDR, maybe. So here we go. This is the very first episode, if I can get this going here, of This I Believe.
This I Believe. By that name, we bring you a new series of radio broadcasts presenting the personal philosophies of thoughtful men and women in all walks of life. In this brief time each night, a banker or a butcher, a painter or a social worker, people of all kinds who need have nothing more in common than integrity, a real honesty, will talk out loud about the rules they live by, the things they have found to be the basic values in their lives. We hardly need to be reminded that we are living in an age of confusion. A lot of us have traded in our beliefs for bitterness and cynicism, or for a heavy package of despair, or even a quivering portion of hysteria. Around us all, now high like a distant thunderhead, now close upon us with the wet, choking intimacy of a London fog, there is an enveloping cloud of fear. There is a physical fear, the kind that drives some of us to flee our homes and burrow into the ground in the bottom of a Montana valley, like prairie dogs, to try to escape, if only for a little while, the sound and the fury of the A-bombs or the hell bombs or whatever may be coming. There is a mental fear, which provokes others of us to see the images of witches in a neighbor's yard and stampedes us to burn down his house. It has become more difficult than ever to distinguish black from white, good from evil, right from wrong. What truths can a human being afford to furnish the cluttered, nervous room of his mind with when he has no real idea how long a lease he has on the future? It is to try to meet the challenge of such questions that we have prepared these broadcasts.
So that's the first episode of This I Believe. And it was almost immediately a phenomenon. From day one, they were deluged with telegrams and letters and phone calls to the radio station. And almost from day one, because of that avalanche of listener mail, CBS affiliates around the country were saying, hey, can we get this thing? And they had always sort of hoped that it would be a nationally syndicated program, but indeed it became a nationally syndicated program in the fall of 1951. And it continued as a daily series all over the country for the next 4 years. It aired Monday through Friday in every major and minor metropolitan area throughout the country. And something else happened in Philadelphia back in that summer. And I can't remember which newspaper it was, but there were 2 daily newspapers at the time, at least 2 in Philadelphia. And one of them, although not the Examiner, I believe. Is that right? Is the Examiner the daily? Inquirer, sorry, my bad. Whatever the other daily newspaper was, decided that they wanted to run these once a week in, I think, their Sunday paper. And so that in turn inspired newspapers all over the country. And there were 100+ newspapers around the country, again in almost every major market, that would run This I Believe in print. That in turn, by the way, also by the end of that summer, they were approached by every major publisher, book publisher in America, all vying for the opportunity to take these essays, because they were written essays that were then read over the air, and turn them into written anthologies. And in 1952, the first of these books came out, and it outsold everything that year but the Bible. And just to give you some perspective on that, that was the year of Peyton Place, which was a blockbuster novel that was, on the tips of everyone's lips. It was also the year of the publication of the granddaddy of sort of self-help books, Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, which is still a bestseller all these years later, albeit a little less so. It's always stayed in print. But the Bible is always the big bestseller, and this was the second bestseller. They came up with another book in 1954 that also did very well. It spawned a series of international books. There was a book published in Egypt of Arabic essays. It was picked up, this was during the Korean War, and very quickly the military and the State Department latched onto this and said, hey, this could be really good for our Cold War aims in the case of the State Department, and military morale in the case of the military. So the military aired it every day on Armed Forces Radio throughout the world, but in particular in the Korean Peninsula. Stars and Stripes magazine had a competition where they invited GIs throughout Korea to write This I Believe essays, and then the best of them were put in Stars and Stripes. We about 2 years ago interviewed one of those GIs who was still alive, whose essay was the winning essay that particular issue. So that was one use of it. And then I mentioned the State Department. The State Department, this was the middle of the Cold War, and we were desperately trying to keep the Soviets at bay and trying to keep them from having too much influence in other countries around the world. So they wanted to use This I Believe as a tool to sort of promote American ideals and demote non-American ideals. And so in particular in the Middle East, that's why they did this Arabic book. It was funded by the State Department to try to promote Americanism in the Arabian Peninsula and in Egypt. So, because even back then we were a little bit concerned about the Middle East, let's just put it that way. Another group that latched onto this, I believe, almost right away were educators. And just like with our contemporary series, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, they were contacted by teachers around the country who said, hey, this is really great, especially when their book came out. We'd like to use this with our students. So their book started to be used as a secondary text in English classes in junior high school and high school, just like you all are doing here. And there were essay writing curricula in the schools, and there were essay writing contests that communities did. And one of those communities was Cleveland, Ohio. And the local newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, sponsored an essay writing contest in their community. And they had some tribunal of local celebrities read these essays, and they picked the best adult essay and the best youth essay. Both of those people were flown to New York. They went to the Stork Club, they stayed at the Waldorf Astoria, and they got to spend an evening with Edward R. Murrow, and then they went into the studio to record their essay. Well, one of the first things I did when I became aware of This I Believe in 2003 was I went through these This I Believe books and figured out who might still be alive. And I latched onto this young woman who was 16 years old in 1954, and I figured there was a high likelihood that she was still alive. So I put her name in a bunch of databases, and she popped up in Who's Who of amongst like college women academics. And she turns out to have been a professor of biology at Cornell University. Back when she was 16, this was her essay for This I Believe. Her name is Elizabeth Deutsch. That was her name as a child.
Every Friday night,
I have a simple faith in the deity, and a hope that my attempts to live a decent life are pleasing to him. If I were to discover that there is no afterlife, my motive for moral living would not be destroyed. I have enough of the philosopher in me to love righteousness for its own sake. This is my youthful philosophy, a simple, liberal, and optimistic feeling, though I fear I may lose some of it as I become more adult. Already, the thought that the traditional thinkers might be right after all, and I wrong, has made me waver. Still, these are my beliefs at 16. If I am mistaken, I am too young to realize my error. Sometimes, in a moment of mental despair, I think of the words, God loves an honest doubter, and am comforted.
So that was 1954, and I'm going to flash forward now, kind of segue, which is our radio term for going from one thing to another, to talk about the contemporary series. And I want to kind of link it up using this woman's story. I became aware of This I Believe in 2003. I was homesick with the flu, looking for something to read, and it turned out my wife had purchased a secondhand copy of one of those best-selling books from the 1950s, and I was a huge fan of Edward R. Murrow. In my world of radio, he's sort of a demigod at very least. And I saw his name on this book, and I was immediately intrigued and started reading it. And I was struck by two things that really moved and inspired me. What moved me was how contemporary the essays read. Even though some of the language was archaic and not archaic, but a little more stilted than contemporary prose writing, the things people were talking about were timeless. And they were just as applicable and felt just as contemporary to my eyes as anything else I might have been reading. Secondly, I was struck by how little I really understood the 1950s, because my view of the 1950s was through the lens of television. And I grew up watching reruns of the shows that people were watching in the 1950s. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, The Danny Thomas Show, you know, all these, you know, where there's a, you know, mom, dad, sis, brother, maybe a housekeeper. They live in the suburbs. Everybody's white. Everybody's dad goes to work, but apparently we don't know what he does. Mom stays home, and everybody helps wash the dishes afterwards. And it all wraps up in 30 minutes. And there's always a nice sort of homily, you know, where you know, Ward's sitting on the bed, you know, and it all, you know, and that's why you should never tell a lie, you know, and it always had a moral, and it was great. That's what I thought the 50s were, and then add on top of that Happy Days and American Graffiti, and you know, so everything was a sock hop. Everybody was happy. There was no discord. Everything was just, you know, just kind of even. That was my vision of the 50s. This is not what they were writing about at all. They were writing about political fear, the same stuff that Edward R. Murrow was saying. I can't tell you the number of essays that begin with a variation of, if civilization can survive, comma, then. So lots of existential fear type essays, lots of essays writing about fear of this country and what had become of it, and its commitment to civil liberties, and it just deeply held and very stridently expressed political beliefs. The other thing I was not prepared for was how many people, black and white, were talking about civil rights and the need for equal rights for everyone in this country. I was shocked by the volume of essays on that subject, especially as early as 1951 and 52. One anecdote that's really striking for me, and one of the essays that really got me excited about this project. There was an essay from a man named Will Thomas, who I'd never heard of, and I bet none of you have ever heard of him. He was a very important African-American reporter for African-American newspapers, and he covered the Jim Crow South and all the lynchings and the rise of the Klan and all this horrible stuff. And as a result, he became so disgusted with America and how it treated African-Americans that he and his family decided to renounce their American citizenship and move to Haiti, because they didn't believe that they could raise their children in this country as African Americans and have them be safe. They were afraid that they wouldn't make it to adulthood. And if they did, that the life that they would be able to provide for them wasn't worth it. So they were ready to throw away their American citizenship and move to Haiti. And I read that essay, and I just was agog. It brought to life what it must have been like to be in that kind of situation, because I grew up in the post, all the major civil rights legislation had already happened, and the freedom rides, and it wasn't unusual for people to be able to vote. I took that for granted growing up in the 1970s. So it brought this time to life. And the other thing that struck me was how very much alike the early 1950s were to the early 2000s. They had just dropped the bomb, right? And we had this palpable experience of the power and destruction of atomic weapons. In 2003, 9/11 was just like 18 months ago. And this palpable fear of what we had just witnessed in terms of the power of, what a handful of people can do with a couple of airplanes and some jet fuel. And both of those experiences, what did they do? They led America into a period of tremendous fear. And the first thing to go are civil liberties and the ability to speak your mind, and for it to be safe to disagree with your government, to be safe to speak out against a war. Okay? There were people protesting against the Korean War before we got into the Korean War. A whole lot of people. It was very unpopular. People did not want to go away and die, and they weren't sure what they were fighting for. Why are we going over there again? What does that have to do with us? What's our interest over there? The domino effect? What are you talking about? But again, people couldn't talk about that then, and I vividly remember in 2003, and for those of you who are too young for this period or don't have clear memories, trust me on this point, there were a lot of people who were deeply afraid to speak their mind, to say, you know what, I'm not so sure we should go to war in Iraq. I don't know if that's a really good idea. There were people really afraid to say that aloud. Fear of losing their jobs. The FBI would start a file on you, and you'd never know it. And they could subpoena the records of what you checked out of the library or what you rented at the video store, and you'd never know it. And then maybe you could be held incommunicado in a prison somewhere, and with no habeas corpus or anything. So it was a scary time then, just like it was a scary time in the 1950s. So that's my long-winded way of explaining why I was so drawn to this. Is its immediacy. And its currency. It seemed like something America could benefit from again. The ability of giving a microphone to average, everyday Americans to step up and talk about the core values that were that they most valued. And I myself, the piece of this that I was most attracted to is I wanted to hear from average folks. I wasn't as interested in celebrities and what they had to say. We debuted on NPR in 2005. They were actually kind of interested in what celebrities had to say. So we came up with this sort of détente where about 40% of the essays we aired were from familiar figures. You know, Bill Gates did an essay for us, and Muhammad Ali, and John McCain, and Newt Gingrich, and John Updike, and Gloria Steinem, and Amy Tan, and lots of, you know, familiar names wrote these essays. But the essays that really moved me the most, for the most part, were from average, everyday Americans, and in particular, from students. And I'm going to play you an essay that we received from a high school student who was assigned this as an assignment in her English class, just like your students are doing here in this area. And when we got this essay, I remember the day when this essay crossed my desk and how much it moved me personally, and I'll tell you in a moment how it affected others. Let's see.
Every Friday night, the cashier at the Chevron gas station Food Mart on Eagle Rock Boulevard and Avenue 40 offers us a discount on all the leftover apples and bananas. To ensure the best selection possible, my mother and I pile into our 20-year-old car and pull up to the Food Mart at 5 p.m., on the dot, ready to get our share of slightly overripe fruits. Chevron shopping started like this. One day, my mother suddenly realized that she had maxed out almost every credit card, and we needed groceries for the week. The only credit card she hadn't maxed out was the Chevron card, and the station on Eagle Rock Boulevard has a pretty big mart attached to it. Since our first visit there, I've learned to believe in flexibility. In my life, it has become necessary to bend the idea of grocery shopping. My mother and I can no longer shop at real grocery stores, but we still get the necessities. Grocery shopping at Chevron has its drawbacks. I'm embarrassed to shop there, and I'm deathly afraid of running into someone I know. I once expressed my fear of being seen shopping at Chevron to my mother, and her eyes shone with disappointment. I know that I hurt her feelings when I try to evade our weekly shopping trips, and that is why I hold on to the idea of flexibility so tightly. I believe that being flexible keeps me going, keeps me from being ashamed of the way my family is different from other families. I remind myself that we won't always have to shop at Chevron, that just because at this point in my life I am struggling does not mean that I will always struggle. My belief in flexibility helps me get through the difficult times because I know that no matter what happens, my mother and I will always figure out a way to survive.
So when that essay aired on NPR, we were inundated with emails, just inundated. And what we weren't expecting, but we probably should have, was we were inundated with checks. Thousands and thousands of dollars in checks that they wanted to go to this young woman. And at the point in time when she wrote this essay, she was not planning on going to college. There was no money saved up for college. Even though she was a pretty good student, she really didn't. The highest she aspired to was maybe community college. She got a free ride at Berkeley. All expenses paid. Tuition, you know, books, everything. From a combination of scholarships and donations. And she just graduated. So she's now... I haven't checked in with her lately. I don't know if she's going to graduate school or what she's doing. But so this is an example of one of the amazing essays that have been submitted to us by kids all over the world. At any given time, and I just shared this with one of your faculty, right at this moment we have over 30,000 essays from students sitting, waiting to be reviewed. We can't keep up with them. In any given month, we get between 3,000 and 4,000 essays. And 80% roughly are all from kids who are being given this assignment in schools all over the world. And interestingly, it's now, you know, every year there's progressively more schools in other parts of the world that are doing this. I was sharing on the ride here that I recently did some research and I looked to see where people were coming to our website from. And in the top 10 markets was Seoul, Korea, and Delhi, India. So this is being used all over the world, and what's really fascinating is to read the essays from rural China and rural India, and then look at teenagers in Kansas And the essays are very similar. The same fears, the same worries, the same aspirations, the same joy, you know. The accent is a little different, you know, the choice of words is a little different, but the essence is all the same. And this is the part of this that's been so rewarding to me, is how this brings communities together. Local communities like yours and international communities. I've had the immense good fortune of traveling the world with this, I believe. I have done events like this in Barcelona. I have, one of the most amazing things I've done is to go to Egypt, where I told you, you know, 60 years before they did this I Believe effort there that was sponsored by the State Department. Well, somehow somebody at the State Department found out about that, and they brought me back to Egypt. And 60 years after they had done that book, we did another book in Arabic that was published by the same people, actually, in Egypt. And I went there, it was the first day of Ramadan and the first day of the Mubarak trial. It was one of the most amazing experiences. And I traveled the country and spoke primarily to students over there. And even though the women wear the hijab and to you maybe they would look different than your students, they were talking about the same stuff. Same stuff. And it was fascinating to me. About 2 weeks maybe before I went to Egypt, I spoke at a small Christian college in, I think, Georgia. And there was a kid there, I remember, who got up and sort of got in my face, and he said, how dare you publish a book, and you call it This I Believe, and you have all these essays that are not about God. I don't understand. What's the point of what you're doing? You know, there is only one thing you need to know, and that's what's in the Bible. So I went over to Egypt, and I'm in Alexandria, Egypt, and I'm speaking to a group of students. And this guy raised his hand, and he said, I don't understand your project. You know, there's this whole book, and no one is talking about Allah. And all you need to know about your belief is what's in the Quran. That's it. And so it was fascinating to me that these beliefs are universal. That particular belief. And by the way, I was in New Jersey maybe a month before that at this other high school in Lenape. And a girl came up to me, almost the same part of the stage that I'm standing right now, after the meeting, after the speech, shaking with anger. And she said, I can't believe how many essays are in your book talking about God. I'm an atheist, and it offends me that you have all those essays in there about God. So, you know you're doing something right when people complain about what you're doing. And for me, this is the great power of this whole idea, which is not my idea. I'm just the current steward of it, if you will, custodian of it. And that is that there are a variety of beliefs throughout the world, throughout every generation, throughout every socioeconomic stratum, throughout every ethnic group, throughout everybody, okay? And sometimes there are radical differences, sometimes there are subtle differences. And I believe what we are called to do as a species is get along with each other, despite them. And maybe not just despite them, but because of them. I share this story because it's so profound to me, and maybe this is a good transition to hearing the essays from your community. One of my best friends back in Louisville, Kentucky, where I live, has political beliefs that are diametrically different than my own. And yet we are the closest of friends. And we can joke with each other about our differing beliefs with great affection. Okay? We never yell at each other. We never make fun of each other. We know that we have these differing beliefs, but what we choose to focus on are the ones that we share. Okay? And this guy is a devoted father. I'm a devoted father. You know, this guy cares a lot about his community. I care a lot about my community. And so we meet there. And we just choose not to talk about, you know, what's going on in Washington or whatever else is going on in the world. And I believe that that is a muscle that needs flexing and exercise and is poorly utilized at this moment in time in our culture. It's far too easy to just listen to people who believe what you believe, to just watch TV stations and listen to talk radio channels that just espouse the things that you are comfortable hearing. And this is my personal editorial comment. I think this country, and really the world over, would be infinitely richer and get along a whole lot better if there was a whole lot more, what would you call it, heterogeneity? You know, a lot more differing voices that we all heard on a day-to-day basis. And that, I believe, is why this particular writing assignment is so useful in schools and in local communities, because it kind of forces people to hear what each other has to say and what is important to them. And I was sharing with one of the teachers here that anecdotally what students around the country have told me, and even around the world, and what their teachers have told me, is that this is so useful in a classroom setting and within a school and within small communities like yours, because people are forced to get to know each other at a deeper level. It is harder to make fun of someone or look down on somebody or put them down when you have gotten a clear view into the shoes that they walk in, okay? And you understand their backstory, and you understand their humanity better. And you can find those places where your beliefs and theirs meet, even if theirs are very different than yours and their experiences are very different. So my hope for your community, and in particular for the schools here that are taking this project on, is that you can really embrace that and build upon that and have it be a very useful tool in your community. Because every place I've traveled and done this sort of work and watched communities take on this I Believe projects, they always come away better than they started. We've yet to get a phone call or an email from somebody who said, I really wish we hadn't spent the last year talking about beliefs in our community and reading those books and writing those essays. It has really been an awful thing for us. I wish we had just kind of watched more TV during this time, you know? Nothing against TV, by the way. Some of my best friends are in TV. But we don't get those calls. The calls we get are just the opposite. And that's what makes the work that I get to do exceptionally rewarding, and that I get to come to communities like yours, and I get to hear wonderful stories like I heard over dinner tonight of exciting and creative things that are being done with this I Believe in this community, and the things that you are poised to perhaps do in the coming year with this. So I hope you'll take the ball and run with it. And the great thing about this is every single community that I've ever visited that does this add some new twist to it that is uniquely theirs. They come up with some idea, some creative idea of, you know, in one place it's how to work with elders, in another place it's how to bring the library system in another place it's how to work with municipal workers, in another place it's how to work with, I don't even know. You're going to find your own thing. And I hope you'll let us know what it is. Because our job, my job, is to just be sort of a repository for all these best practices. And then when somebody calls us from some other community, whether they're across the state in New Jersey or in another part of the world, and say, you know, they did this cool thing at Hopewell Valley, you might want to consider trying. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to members of your community who have taken the challenge of writing this I Believe essay. And we're going to hear from some of your colleagues, the students from the schools here, the teachers that work here, and members of the community. And to introduce them, we're going to hear from Andy Paul, who is one of the English teachers here. So there he is. It's amazing. It's like having a magic wand. So I give you Andy. And afterwards, we'll take some questions. So be thinking up those really like sterling questions for the Q&A period.